Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a world where marble columns shimmered in torchlight, silks rustled behind closed villa doors, and moans echoed through candlelit bathhouses, just steps away from Senate halls. You're standing on the worn cobblestones of ancient Rome, a place of unrivaled opulence and unimaginable depravity. The flicker of oil lamps casts shadows on walls that have seen everything from brutal gladiatorial fights to midnight orgies hosted by emperors in disguise. Behind the grandeur of the empire lay a hidden chamber of curiosities, rituals, and taboos that would make even modern sensibilities blush. You might think you're ready for this, but you probably won't survive this particular stroll through Roman bedrooms with your innocence intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your city and local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you're all tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking through the Subura district, the gritty, overpopulated heart of Rome. Perfumed senators and toga-clad matrons avoid these streets where laundry flaps from second-story windows and street vendors shout over the clamor. But you're not here for politics. You're headed for the dim alleys, the rooms that smell of sweat and oil wine and musk, where the real Rome plays out after dark. A curtain parts, and you step inside a lupanar, a Roman brothel. It's surprisingly clean, the walls frescoed with vivid paintings of acts that leave very little to the imagination. And that's the point. In Rome, sex wasn't hidden. It was a mural, a menu, a marketing strategy. The Romans didn't have a word for homosexual or heterosexual the way we do. They classified sex by dominant status and role. The active partner, typically male, was expected to penetrate. The passive partner, whether female, male, or enslaved, was expected to be available, submissive, and silent. The issue was not what you did, but how you did it and to whom. For a Roman citizen male to be penetrated was scandalous unless you were still a boy. But to do the penetrating, that was power. That was Roman. Slaves had no rights over their bodies. If you were enslaved, you were expected to be sexually available to your master or mistress. Sex wasn't just for pleasure, it was a display of ownership. And it wasn't just confined to private quarters. Wealthy Romans often displayed their slaves like walking statues, nude, oiled, leashed by delicate chains. In elite banquets, hosts sometimes offered the use of their most attractive slaves as part of the evening's entertainment, right after the wine and just before the poetry recitals. And no one raised an eyebrow. This wasn't scandalous, it was fashionable. You pause before one of the cubicula, the small private rooms of the brothel. Inside, a woman reclines on the edge of a stone bed covered in worn blankets. A customer enters, drops a coin into a small niche in the wall, and joins her without a word. Privacy isn't part of the equation here. The walls are thin, the moans audible, the business brisk. Some women and men working in the lupanaria saw dozens of clients a day. Their names, sometimes scratched into the wall beside their room like a Yelp review carved into stone. Felicia best ride in Subura. And then there were the elite, the emperors, the patricians who indulged their desires with theatrical flair. Take Emperor Tiberius, for instance. He retired to the island of Capri and transformed it into a secluded haven of debauchery. There he trained young boys and girls to swim between his legs and nibble him underwater. He called them his little fish. And no, that's not a metaphor. Tiberius also kept a book of erotic illustrations drawn from myths as instruction manuals. His retreat was filled with statues of gods and goddesses, mid-coitus, inspiring or justifying whatever took place on those marble floors. But if Tiberius was depraved, Caligula was unhinged. He turned the imperial palace into a brothel. He reportedly slept with his sisters, sometimes parading them around like trophies. He once announced he would make his horse a consul, but more disturbingly, he threw lavish orgies where guests were chosen not by beauty, but by political allegiance. Sex in Caligula's hands was not only pleasure, it was leverage. The whispered question in Rome wasn't, "Did you sleep with the emperor?" It was, "Did you refuse?" The Emperor Nero married 2 men during his reign, one of whom, Sporus, he had castrated and dressed as a woman to serve as his wife. Roman society may not have cared about the gender of one's lover, but Nero's theatrics pushed even those boundaries. Still, few dared to question him. Sporus appeared at court in silks makeup and jewelry, addressing Nero as husband and playing his role with tragic obedience. You glance up and notice an old mosaic above the brothel exit, a phallus with wings mid-flight, and a cheerful inscription, Hic habitat felicitas. Happiness lives here. The Romans saw sex as divine and earthly, sacred and ridiculous. The god Priapus, eternally aroused and laughing, adorned gardens and thresholds to ward off evil. His massive, erect member was a symbol of fertility and luck. Children passed these statues daily on the way to school. No one thought twice. And yet behind all this openness, there were lines not to cross, though they were blurry, flexible, and often hypocritically enforced. Adultery was a crime, but only if you were a woman or the passive male lover of a citizen. A husband could sleep with slaves, prostitutes, or concubines without penalty, but a wife, even the suspicion, could lead to exile, or worse. Now you're leaving the brothel back into the Roman night. A procession passes a drunken Bacchic revel with masked dancers and tambourines, their laughter echoing off the brick walls. Somewhere a senator wakes from a dream of Venus. Somewhere else a slave silently prepares a bed for his mistress's next nocturnal adventure. You trail behind the Bacchic procession for a while, their wild rhythm luring you through narrow archways and into a grand open courtyard lit by flickering torches. The dancers, cloaked in ivy and smeared with wine, chant odes to Dionysus Bacchus, as the Romans called him, the god of ecstasy, madness, and release. Their feet move with unhinged, abandoned hips grinding against the drums, their eyes rolling skyward in feverish bliss. This isn't a performance. It's a ceremony. One that's about to spiral into something far more primal. You slip past them and into a side corridor, where the floor is littered with grape skins and discarded robes. Here, in the shadowed corners of Rome, religious rites and sexual rituals blurred like watercolors in the rain. The Romans had dozens of gods and goddesses tied to fertility, lust, and carnal pleasure. Venus, Cupid, Priapus, Bacchus, Liber, Flora, and worship often involved more than prayers. The Liberalia festival, for example, honored the transition of boys into manhood, with songs, wine, and occasionally sexual rites designed to open them to adulthood. The Floralia festival celebrated spring with public nudity, theatrical stripteases, and actors mimicking sexual acts on stage to amuse and arouse the crowd. But nothing quite compares to the cult of Cybele. Cybele was a foreign goddess imported from the East, worshipped with manic drumming, whirling dances, and self-mutilation. Her priests, called Galli, castrated themselves in a frenzy of devotion, donning women's robes and heavy makeup afterward. Though scorned by Roman elites for their gender-bending appearance, they were tolerated, sometimes even revered, for their spiritual power. Their rituals included ecstatic orgies and trances so intense that onlookers swore the galley spoke in divine tongues. This idea of sacred sexuality wasn't unique to fringe cults. Even the Vestal Virgins, Rome's most esteemed priestesses, were caught in the crosshairs of sexual scrutiny. Sworn to 30 years of chastity, their virginity wasn't just a personal vow, it was Rome's lifeline. If a Vestal was found guilty of breaking her vow, she wasn't flogged or jailed. She was buried alive. But consider this, in many whispers, it was emperors or generals who seduced or forced them. The Vestals were often scapegoats punished for the desires of men in power. From the holy to the household, you now enter the domus of a wealthy Roman patrician. The marble floors are cooled by circulating water beneath. Mosaics of gods mid-coitus decorate the entryway, casually shocking by modern standards, but no more controversial than a family portrait to Roman eyes. The master of the house is in his triclinium, a lavish dining room, where guests recline on couches and sip spiced wine. But this is no ordinary dinner party. This is a convivium, and tonight's entertainment goes well beyond harp music. A slender flute player performs nude, while two dancers, also naked, move with calculated sensuality. The host, red-faced from wine, claps in delight and beckons a young serving boy to sit beside him. Guests laugh and grope and toast to Jupiter. Some drift off to the adjoining chamber, where the real pleasures begin, arranged threesomes, wagered dares, and games of dice where the loser might be stripped and blindfolded for the rest of the night. In Rome, this wasn't depravity. This was leisure. And for Roman women of wealth and station, sex was a theater of strategy. While society placed limits on their sexual freedom publicly, at least some women learned to maneuver within these boundaries with astonishing skill. Take Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius. Behind her demure veil, she led a double life, reportedly slipping out at night to work in a brothel under a false name, competing with other women to see who could take the most lovers before sunrise. Historians painted her as a nymphomaniac, a monster, but maybe they simply feared a woman who dared enjoy pleasure as freely as a man. Others, like Julia, the daughter of Emperor Augustus, were banished for their promiscuity. Julia flaunted her lovers, mocked her husband, and held court in the Roman Forum at night, like it was her own playground. Her father, who had championed moral reforms and criminalized adultery, couldn't bear the hypocrisy. She was exiled to a barren island cut off from the luxuries of the capital, but never forgotten in its gossip. You leave the domus through the garden, where moonlight glimmers off fountains shaped like embracing lovers. Statues of satyrs and nymphs dot the hedges, some locked in eternal positions of delight. Sex was literally etched into the landscape. Even in Pompeii, frozen in time by volcanic ash, phalluses were carved into sidewalks pointing to brothels, and home shrines featured scenes of lust as prayers for fertility. But not all Roman sex was glamorous. The urban poor, who lacked marble bedrooms or silken robes, made do in cramped, dark tenements known as insulae. Privacy was rare. Couples might have sex behind a curtain, beside sleeping children or neighbors. Some rented beds by the hour. And yet even in these tight quarters, sexuality remained a part of daily life, not taboo, but elemental. As you move through the dim hallway of one such tenement, a wooden door creaks open. Inside, a prostitute adjusts her tunic while her client dresses. They barely speak. No shame, no seduction, just transaction. Her body, as common as bread and wine, is both weapon and livelihood. Roman law allowed prostitution, even taxed it. Yet prostitutes, like actors and gladiators, were denied the respectability of good citizens. They lived in a strange limbo, desired, tolerated, but never honored. And here lies the contradiction. Rome worshipped sex in its temples, immortalized it in marble, splashed it across frescoes. Yet the same empire punished women for adultery, banished daughters for lust, and sneered at the lovers they themselves paid for. Sex was a mirror revealing Rome's pleasure power and hypocrisy in equal measure. A distant temple bell tolls midnight. Somewhere another orgy begins. Somewhere else a senator climbs into bed beside a boy he purchased at the market that morning. And you, silent drifting, have just begun to understand how deep Rome's passion ran, and how often it burned those who dared to play with it. You find yourself standing outside a Roman bathhouse, now Thermae they call it. But this is no ordinary public washroom. These cavernous complexes were the social lungs of the empire. Heated floors, steamy air, cold plunge pools, and rows of oil-slicked bodies moving in practiced rhythm. They weren't just here to bathe. They were here to see and be seen gossip strike deals, and sometimes satisfy desires that steamed just below the surface. As you enter, you're immediately greeted by the dense scent of sweat oil and old marble. The steam curls around your ankles, then your waist, then your shoulders, until your body disappears from sight. And that's exactly how many Romans liked it. Shadows danced across pale stone, as men and women separately or together, depending on the day, lounged naked in the tepidarium, or pressed their bodies against the mosaic tiles of the caldarium. These were places of pleasure disguised as hygiene. In the corners, whispers float like incense smoke. Rendezvous are scheduled with a nod, a passing touch, or a shared towel. Masseurs, often young and beautiful, knead flesh with perfumed oil, but sometimes their hands stray a little lower, their touch lingering a little longer. You realize the line between healing and teasing was thinner than a strand of Roman silk. And when the day's light fades and the guards look the other way, the bathhouse becomes something else entirely, a silent arena of glances, propositions, and unspoken permissions. Roman poets didn't hide these truths. In fact, they flaunted them. Catullus, Ovid, Martial, they all wrote of sex with biting wit and open lust. Ovid's Ars Amatoria was essentially a pickup manual teaching men how to seduce women at the circus, in temples, at banquets. He even included tips for cheating on your spouse without getting caught. His writing was so shamelessly seductive that Augustus eventually exiled him for it, though not before the book became a sensation. Martial, on the other hand, specialized in scathing epigrams. He mocked impotent men, praised virile boys, and openly laughed at the sexual hypocrisy of Roman elites. His verses were the Twitter threads of ancient Rome, short, savage, and wildly inappropriate. You pause in the frigidarium now, the cold plunge pool where flushed skin tightens and gasps fill the chamber. A man dives in naked beside you and surfaces with a grin, water beating down his chest. Nearby, a patrician is whispering to his client, a young man in his early 20s, likely one of the many attractive Greek boys imported to Rome under the guise of education. He reads philosophy by day and shares his master's bed by night. It's not love, it's arrangement. But that doesn't make the moans any quieter behind closed doors. And speaking of arrangements, Rome's sexual economy was vast, flexible, and brutally transactional. There were courtesans educated, witty, and expensive who could recite Virgil in the morning and entertain generals at night. There were male prostitutes who catered to both women and men, often available at the bathhouses or street corners near the Circus Maximus. There were Sinaiadi flamboyant men who danced erotically, wore makeup, and took pleasure in being penetrated. Though mocked by Roman society, they carved out their own niche, sometimes even becoming celebrities of a sort, objects of fascination and fear. But perhaps the most haunting stories come from the empire's edges, from the colonia, the military outposts where soldiers lived for decades, far from Rome and far from women. Officially, Roman soldiers were forbidden to marry. Unofficially, they took lovers, sometimes local women, sometimes fellow soldiers. Some relationships were consensual, others not so much. The isolation, the boredom, the power imbalance, it created a boiling pot of desires, frustrations, and unrecorded abuse. In Vindolanda, a Roman fort near Hadrian's Wall in Britain, archaeologists found writing tablets detailing soldiers' daily lives. Among them were coded notes likely referring to sexual favors or partners. One even jokingly complained that the bathhouse boy had teeth like a wolf and the manners of a Gaul, but that he pleased well enough. Behind the humor was something darker, a world where bodies were traded, borrowed, and forgotten. You leave the bathhouse and step into a garden courtyard fragrant with laurel and rosemary. Statues of Venus rise from fountains, her marble hips curved just so. But you're not alone. You see two figures beneath a fig tree, one draped in a senator's robe, the other barely clothed. Their faces are inches apart. You look away instinctively, but in Rome discretion is a foreign concept. Now you're drawn toward a nearby villa, smaller, more discreet. Inside you find shelves lined with pessoi, smooth ceramic discs used for cleaning after defecation. But many of them are inscribed with names. Not just any names. Names of political rivals. It was a cruel joke, scrub yourself with the name of the man you hate. But it also reveals something else. For the Romans, the body, its pleasures, and its disgusts was a tool for status, revenge, and even politics. Consider this, one of the cruelest insults in Rome was not that someone committed adultery, but that they enjoyed being penetrated. Pathicus, a passive, submissive male, was the lowest form of man. You could lie, steal, even murder, but if you were thought to enjoy sex like a woman, your dignity was irreparably shattered. Even emperors weaponized these labels. Caligula famously accused his enemies of sexual degeneracy, having pamphlets distributed with explicit drawings and verses mocking their manhood. Accusation was enough. No proof needed. You're beginning to understand Roman sexuality wasn't just about desire. It was a language, a way of asserting power, expressing class, enforcing gender roles, punishing enemies. To be in control was everything. To lose control, whether in bed or in public, was humiliation. As you drift through the villa's hallway, you pass a small room. A girl no older than 13 sits beside her new husband, a man well into his 40s. She stares blankly ahead while he strokes her hair. This too was Rome. Marriages were often political contracts. Girls were betrothed by 12 married soon after, and expected to produce heirs before they even understood what sex meant. Some were lucky and found kindness. Others became pregnant before they were fully grown. Their stories were written in silence, in stillbirths and long, aching winters. And just as the air begins to feel heavy with all you've seen, the sun begins to rise. Dawn spills over the rooftops of Rome like melted gold. You've wandered through brothels and bathhouses, villas and tenements, temples and taverns. You've seen love twisted by power, lust, mistaken for worship, and innocence snuffed out before it even began. But Rome is just waking up. Another day, another indulgence. And you've only begun to scratch the surface of its dark, delicious, and devastating intimacy. The early Roman morning breaks gently now, but not for everyone. You drift through the open streets as vendors set up their stalls and slaves hurry with baskets of bread and wine. Yet behind the ornate facade of a nearby domus, something else stirs, something older than hunger. A woman stretches on silk sheets, her naked body illuminated by golden shafts of sunlight. Her husband, long gone to attend Senate meetings, has left her with only the company of her thoughts, her servants. And her secret lover, who as fate would have it, is quietly climbing over the courtyard wall at this very moment. This isn't a scandal. It's a daily routine. For all the public obsession with honor and virtue, private Roman households were theaters of secrecy and sexual gamesmanship. Affairs were common, expected even. So long as discretion was maintained and status preserved, men and women alike indulged their appetites. Letters were exchanged through slaves. Lovers were smuggled into garden rooms. Gifts, jewelry, poems, exotic perfume were carefully coded signals. It was less about sin and more about strategy. You follow the young lover through the side entrance and into the woman's arms. They kiss like they've done it 100 times. And maybe they have. Maybe they were childhood friends. Or maybe he was once her servant, now elevated through pleasure to something almost like power. She whispers in Latin, a command disguised as endearment. He obeys, his tunic already slipping to the floor. In Rome, sex was rarely just sex. It was always layered status class obligation control. A noblewoman might find herself married at 14 to a much older man, used as a pawn in his ambitions, and expected to bear children by the time she turned 17. With her body no longer her own, the only pleasure she could claim was in secret, in darkness, with someone whose name would never be spoken aloud. It wasn't love. It was reclamation. You wander next into a school courtyard, where young boys chant verses from Virgil under the hot gaze of a teacher. Education in Rome was more than arithmetic and poetry. For some, especially those being trained for future political power, it included lessons on eloquence control, and disturbingly, sometimes submission. Wealthy patrons took on puer delicatus, young boys, often slaves or foreigners chosen for their beauty, and trained to entertain, accompany, and satisfy. These boys were pampered, perfumed, and paraded through the streets like accessories. And while some Romans condemned the practice in philosophy, they still lined up for their chance to indulge. The line between affection and exploitation was obliterated by the laws of ownership. A slave had no voice, no consent, no recourse. Their cries, if there were any, vanished into marble walls and history's blind spot. You can almost hear one such boy now softly strumming a lyre for his master in a shaded peristyle. He's no older than 10, but his eyes are weary, already trained to anticipate mood, need, desire. He smiles when his master laughs. He blushes when the older man reaches for his hand. And later, when the household sleeps, he will tiptoe across cold floors into the master's chamber, lie still, and endure what has become routine. The Romans might call this beauty, but you know it for what it is. Further down the road, you pass a small temple dedicated to Venus Erycina, goddess of erotic love. This isn't the Venus of romance and roses. This is the Venus of lust and danger. Her priestesses were known not for purity, but for seduction. They performed dances that mimicked sex acts. They blessed couples with fertility rites that involved symbolic penetration, rhythmic moaning, and at times actual intercourse beneath sacred veils. You notice a ritual beginning now. A young couple stands before the altar, while two veiled women chant and circle them, waving bundles of herbs. The couple is instructed to touch one another slowly, reverently, as the priestesses guide them through a sacred rhythm meant to awaken divine favor. It's hypnotic, half ceremony, half foreplay. But this was how Rome saw the act, not dirty, not profane, but cosmic. Even the gods, after all, had endless affairs. Jupiter, in particular, was notorious for seducing mortals in the form of animals' mist or even golden rain. If the heavens were so driven by desire, why shouldn't mortals follow suit? Still, lust always had a price. Now you find yourself at the Pons Sublicius, the ancient wooden bridge over the Tiber. Here criminals were sometimes punished, and among the condemned were stupratores, those guilty of seducing virgins or committing incest, particularly if the act threatened family honor. A father discovering his daughter had been deflowered without marriageable intent had the legal right to kill both her and her lover. And occasionally they did. You watch one such sentence unfold now. A man trembling and bruised is being tied to the bridge's edge. He is not a monster, merely poor, caught in bed with a senator's daughter. She is already locked away, never to be seen again. The punishment isn't about justice. It's about status reputation control. With a sharp push, the man is cast into the river below his body, twisting in the current as it disappears. But here's the irony. Those same senators who demanded purity in their daughters often indulged in the very same behaviors in secret. They paid for virgins, they threw orgies, they used slaves, yet when it came to their family's name, a single kiss could mean disgrace. And speaking of orgies, you feel a sudden pull toward one of Rome's most notorious homes, the domus of Gaius Petronius, poet and courtier under Emperor Nero. Petronius was called the arbiter of elegance, a man who knew pleasure like a priest knew prayer. His parties were infamous. You wander through one now, gold-plated cups, edible sculptures, wine fountains, and every room filled with laughter, nudity, and soft moaning. There are no rules here. Men with men, women with women, slaves with senators. Bodies move like waves, shifting and colliding in rhythm. No one asks questions. No one keeps count. It is indulgence without limit, a carnival of flesh and ego. Yet even here in this seeming paradise, the undercurrent remains: who holds power, who commands the moment, who submits. Because in Rome it was never just about who you loved. It was about who you could own, control, or destroy with a single touch. And as the doors to Petronius's villa close behind you, muffling the symphony of desire within, you're left with the unsettling truth in the Roman Empire. Pleasure was both privilege and peril, always beautiful, always brutal. The night is far from over. In fact, this is when Rome becomes most itself, when the streets hush and secrets awaken behind locked doors. You follow the curve of the Aventine Hill, past shrines to obscure gods and shuttered bakeries until you come to a heavy wooden gate. It opens without a knock. You're inside a villa, but not one of imperial excess. This is the home of a high-ranking Roman matron, and tonight she's hosting a gathering unlike any other, a private symposium, but not for philosophy, unless you count the study of pleasure as a form of knowing. Inside, the lamps burn low, and the air is perfumed with crushed herbs and sandalwood. On silken couches recline Rome's finest women widows, wives of governors, priestesses, even the odd poetess barefoot and wrapped in loose tunics, sipping wine and whispering stories to one another. There are no men here. That is the point. One woman steps forward holding a scroll. She begins to read, not Virgil or Cicero, but from Satyricon, or perhaps from her own hidden writings, verses about lust, about being touched, about longing, in a language far more explicit than anything allowed in polite company. The women laugh, lean, and murmur their own tales in response. They pass around small jars, ointments, oils, carved ivory charms, shaped like phalluses and snakes. This is Rome's quieter, richer undercurrent, the hidden erotic world of elite women, where secrets are currency and language becomes liberation. You glance around and notice the mosaics on the floor. They're not of gods or generals, but of lovers. Two women reclining beneath fig trees, their hands lost beneath robes. These aren't accidents, they're choices. Because while male desire strutted through the forum, female desire thrived in shadows. Rome had no formal category for lesbianism, no public acknowledgement, but that didn't mean it didn't exist. It lived here in whispered gatherings and coded poems, in glances held a second too long during a festival in handmaidens, who slept not in the servants' quarters, but in the master's wife's bed. Now you leave the villa wandering toward the insulae Rome's high-rise apartments that stretched stories above the poorer districts. In one cramped room, a woman reclines on a straw mattress, while a man grimy from work and barely sober fumbles with her tunic. They exchange no words. There's no passion. It's a scene that plays out nightly across the empire sex, not for joy, but routine. He finishes quickly and rolls over. She stares at the ceiling, the oil lamps flicker, bouncing shadows across the cracked plaster. Not all Roman sex was decadent. In fact, most of it wasn't. It was mundane, mechanical, a matter of survival. For the working classes, intimacy was rarely tender and almost never private. Walls were thin. Beds were shared. Even brothels were sometimes more comfortable than home. And when it came to consent, the lines were often non-existent, especially for enslaved women who had no legal personhood. Their bodies were commodities bartered as part of dowries, household gifts, or simply used at will by the head of the house or his sons. You pause outside one such domus, and inside hear it the creaking of a bed frame, the muffled sobs of a slave girl, and the silence of everyone else pretending not to hear. You can feel the cruelty of the empire like weight in the air, not just in its laws, but in its indifference. And yet, even in bondage, some found power in seduction. Some slaves used sex as leverage to gain favor, improve living conditions, or secure manumission. The Roman playwright Plautus wrote of clever slave women who ensnared their masters and reshaped their fate through charm and cunning. Of course, that was comedy. Reality was far messier, far sadder. But it's true, sex could be currency, and for those with nothing else, it sometimes had to be enough. You wander next into a physician's home, not the kind who tends to emperors, but one who treats women especially in matters of the womb. On the shelves are scrolls and surgical tools, but also strange amulets and dried herbs, pennyroyal, silphium, myrrh. These were used in contraceptive mixtures, pessaries, infusions, powders, all part of Rome's rich, if dangerous, tradition of reproductive control. Silphium, in particular, was prized. A plant from North Africa, it was rumored to be so effective at preventing pregnancy that it was harvested to extinction. The Roman women who used it weren't ignorant. They were informed. They knew the stakes. Pregnancy could mean death, or exile, or being married off before your body was ready. So they took risks. Some even sought out abortion, though the methods were painful and often fatal. Midwives were both revered and feared for their knowledge, not just of birthing life, but of ending it. Now walk with me to the outskirts of Rome, to the Columbarium, the underground tombs where freedmen and women were buried. In one niche lies the stone of a woman named Claudia Severa. The inscription reads that she was a faithful wife, a skilled spinner of wool, and a consolation to her husband in all ways. The euphemism isn't subtle. Even in death, sexuality clung to reputation. To be remembered for your wifely obedience was a badge of honor, never mind what that obedience had cost. And yet Rome's obsession with appearances didn't stop them from celebrating erotica in art. You pass a merchant's shop and peek into his storeroom where he keeps the good stuff, the frescoes, lamps, and ceramics too obscene for display. One depicts a woman riding a man like a chariot. Another shows a group of men tangled in a writhing heap. These weren't illegal. They were collectibles. Proof that beneath the veneer of control, Romans loved to laugh at and long for the very things they claimed to regulate. You walk back into the city center now through the Forum, where statues of statesmen tower above. But you know their stories. You know which senator kept a boy under his desk, which general wrote love poems to a gladiator, which philosopher declared pleasure a vice in public, while drowning in it in private. You know that Rome's greatness was not built on marble alone, it was built on flesh, on the management of desire, on the suppression of guilt beneath layers of power. And as the stars dim and the sky begins to pale, you realize something else in Rome: sex was never private. It was everywhere, in stone, in law, in laughter, in tears. It was the empire's heartbeat, sometimes gentle, often cruel, always pounding beneath its polished exterior. And you, wandering soul, invisible witness, have barely scratched the surface. Dawn creeps over the 7 hills, casting a pink-gold haze across Rome's rooftops. But the city is never truly at rest. Somewhere a baker's apprentice is kneading dough. Somewhere else a senator is slipping out of a lover's bed before his wife stirs. You walk along the banks of the Tiber now, where early risers perform ablutions and toss scraps to gulls. But your feet carry you not to temples or markets, no. Today you're drawn to the roar of a different crowd, one that lusts not for love or power, but for blood. You've arrived at the Ludus Magnus, Rome's largest gladiator school, nestled behind the Grand Colosseum. Inside, the air is heavy with sweat and oil. Dozens of young men, some volunteers, many slaves are drilling sparring training. Their bodies gleam in the light, every muscle taut with tension. This is not only a place of battle, it's a place of spectacle. And for many Romans, a place of erotic obsession. Gladiators were sex symbols. Their fame, like modern celebrities, was matched only by the public's desire to possess them figuratively or literally. Women of every social rank fantasized about them. Wealthy matrons sent them tokens of affection, combs, rings, locks of hair, even undergarments soaked in perfume. They paid to watch them bathe after matches, to touch their scars, to collect their blood as aphrodisiac. You step into the private viewing gallery of a patrician woman. She clutches a hand fan and leans forward as a Thracian fighter swings his sword during a mock duel. Her breath quickens. Her husband doesn't notice, or doesn't care. He's busy appraising a different gladiator. Attraction in Rome was unbound by gender, but confined by rank. Citizens could desire whoever they wanted, as long as they remained the dominant force. Later, you follow the fighters back to their quarters. Some slump into cots, others laugh and slap each other's backs. One disappears into a side room where a senator's wife waits in shadow, veil already dropped to her shoulders. She pays handsomely for his silence, but she knows it isn't love. It's an arrangement written in bruises and coins. And he, the gladiator, knows this encounter offers no freedom, only momentary escape. From the brutal to the theatrical, your path leads you now to a mimous performance, Rome's most bawdy stage tradition. The mimi weren't subtle. They specialized in satire sex and slapstick, often performing obscene plays that left nothing to imagination. On stage now, two actors mime a lover's quarrel that ends in a simulated orgy involving a fake goat and a wine jug. The crowd howls, children giggle, senators pretend to scowl while barely containing their smirks. In Rome, public indecency was not only tolerated, it was celebrated in the right context. Theatrical performances gave permission to say what could not be said elsewhere. On festival days, the city became a playground of inversion. Slaves dressed as masters, women as soldiers, children as magistrates. And in that liminal space, sexual roles could be mocked, reversed, parodied, but only for a day. You leave the stage behind and head down the Vicus Patricius, where rumor has it, a certain brothel caters to Rome's most unorthodox appetites. The lantern outside glows red. The doorman doesn't ask your name. Inside each room is themed Egyptian Greek barbarian. Costumes are offered. Masks, too. A Roman senator reclines while a man dressed as a Dacian warrior chains him to a column. In another room, a woman in golden bangles reenacts the seduction of Cleopatra. This isn't history, it's fantasy. And the Romans were masters of it. Here people came to shed their identities like robes, to become submissive, powerful, genderless, or divine. You could pretend to be a captured enemy, a goddess, a satyr. There were no boundaries except that of the purse. This level of indulgence wasn't cheap. But what about those who couldn't afford such illusions? You head to a narrow alley behind the Capitoline Hill, where the scortum vagum, the wandering prostitutes, ply their trade. These men and women aren't registered. They have no fixed brothel, no taxes to pay. They lean against walls, waiting. Their eyes say everything. They are the forgotten performers in Rome's great theater of lust, unprotected, underpaid, and easily discarded. One such girl stands barefoot on the stones, not more than 16. A soldier walks past, stops, hands her a coin. She follows him into a side room. No names, no pleasantries, just the sound of a deal struck in silence. When he leaves, she adjusts her tunic, sits, and waits for the next. This is not Venus's temple. It is Rome's gutter. And yet even here, sex carries strange echoes of divinity. You come across a street shrine dedicated to Fascinus, the divine phallus, a crude stone sculpture. Part man, part winged phallus smiles down at passers-by. Romans believed Fascinum warded off evil. Soldiers wore phallic amulets into battle. Mothers tied tiny ones to babies' cradles. Phallic wind chimes called tintinnabula rang out in doorways to scare away curses. To modern eyes, it's absurd. But to the Romans, the phallus was more than a symbol of sex. It was vitality, life force, protection. They wore it, worshipped. It laughed at it sometimes all at once. You return to the Forum as night draws near once more. There, under a colonnade, two philosophers argue over Epicurean versus Stoic definitions of pleasure. One insists that true pleasure lies in temperance and self-control. The other laughs, quoting Lucretius, "The gods don't care. So why should we deny ourselves?" And perhaps that is the Roman question. With no heaven or hell, no promise of divine punishment, pleasure was not a sin. It was simply a choice, a tactic, a currency, a curse. The sun dips. Torches are lit again. And you You've walked through Rome's most sacred halls and filthiest corners. You've watched women seduce gladiators, slaves weep into pillows, and emperors play gods. And still, Rome holds more behind its eyes, more names unspoken, more masks yet to fall. So keep walking soft and unseen. Because the city's darkest stories are never told in the light. The torches are flickering now, casting long, uneasy shadows across the cobblestones. Rome is never truly silent, but there's a hush in the air that speaks of secrets not meant for daylight. You're back in the heart of the Subura, that maze of filth and flesh, where senators send servants in disguise, and young patricians slip away from dinner parties for pleasures their fathers outlaw in public. You pass a doorway where painted red symbols mark the entrance to a clandestine collegium, an underground club technically illegal where citizens gather in secret to share stories, wine, and desires that society refuses to name. The host, a rotund older man with coal-lined eyes and fingers heavy with rings, greets guests with a kiss on both cheeks. Inside, everyone wears masks, not to hide, to reveal. Because here, masks don't conceal identity, they release it. A young man dressed as a satyr dances beside a woman cloaked as Medusa, her painted snakes writhing in rhythm to the drums. Two men kiss in the corner, then part as if they've done it 100 times, and maybe they have. A senator sits beside a slave not as master and servant, but as equals. No names, no obligations. Just bodies in motion moving in time to ancient rhythms. It's a freedom they cannot afford in daylight, so they steal it here between midnight and shame. And yet, as you float past these revelers, you can feel the weight pressing in. Rome allowed many things, but not freedom, not truly. Every pleasure had a cost, every deviation a risk. These men and women live between the lines of law, threading their desire like a needle through the loopholes of custom and status. One accusation, one jealous whisper, and everything collapses. You slip out again, the cool air bracing. Ahead, a shadowed figure holds a scroll beneath his arm, muttering to himself. He's a philosopher, or maybe a madman, often the same thing in Rome. He speaks of luxuria, of decadence corrupting the republic, of how Rome's rise has been bought with virtue, and its fall will come through vice. You wonder if he's wrong. You head toward a domus in the Esquiline district where a wedding is underway. Laughter spills into the streets. The bride is barely 14, her veil so long, it trails over the floor like spilled milk. The groom is a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a triumphal ring. She offers her hand as instructed, her other clenching the garland of fertility herbs so tightly her knuckles go white. The guests cheer as they disappear into the cubiculum. Roman marriages, after all, were not sacred bonds of love. They were contracts, business deals, tools of alliance. The bride may not know what's expected of her, but her body soon will. Her virginity, in fact, is a key asset, something confirmed by the midwife the next morning, when blood-stained sheets are offered to the bride's father as proof of honor. You linger only a moment before drifting past. Not out of disrespect, but because you know these moments are repeated endlessly across the empire, from Sicily to Syria, from Britain to Egypt. And while the faces change, the structures remain. Further on, the temple of Isis rises before you, its Egyptian columns crowned with incense smoke. Rome didn't just conquer lands, it absorbed their gods, their customs, their sensualities. Isis, once a foreign goddess, is now beloved by Roman women. Her temples are places of mystery where priestesses chant in tongues and bathe in milk, where the sacred and the erotic bleed into one another like wine and water. Here you witness a ritus amoris, a love ritual for women who seek passion or fertility or release. A girl stands at the altar, her breasts bare, her hands holding lotus blossoms. The priestess anoints her with oils and whispers invocations in a dialect no one else understands. The girl weeps not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of being seen, honored, touched without judgment. Rome's women didn't have temples for themselves, not really. They had roles: wife, mother, matron, mistress. But here in Isis's embrace, they reclaim a part of themselves not listed in any law book. You pass a mural painted on the temple wall. It shows Isis embracing Osiris, his body dismembered and then resurrected through her love. It's graphic, yes, but symbolic too. In Rome, even myth was eroticized. Gods were rarely chaste. Jupiter disguised himself as golden rain to impregnate Danae. Neptune ravished Medusa in Athena's temple. Mars and Venus were lovers caught in a net by Vulcan. The divine was not detached from lust, it was driven by it. You wander next into a bathhouse, not for men this time, but women. It's quieter here, softer. The laughter is gentler, the air filled with floral oils rather than sweat and blood. A group of women bathe together, sharing gossip, trading recipes, brushing each other's hair. One rubs olive oil on another's shoulders, her fingers slow and knowing. Their eyes meet, hold, then part again. There are no guards here, no audience, just unspoken things, longing, safety, recognition. The empire has no words for this, no laws, no vocabulary for women so loving women. But it exists anyway, blooming like rosemary and cracked stone. The sun is setting again. Rome glows like hot bronze, and the shadows stretch longer than before. You make your way through the field of Mars, where soldiers train with wooden swords, grunting and sweating. But even here, where masculinity parades itself in steel and fury, there are undercurrents. The shared tents, the lonely nights, the brotherhood that sometimes becomes more. Not all touch in Rome is violent. Some is cautious, tender, hidden. And as you stand beneath the archway, watching lovers drift past in pairs, some with joined hands, others only with joined glances, you understand the final truth of Roman sexuality. It was everything. It was everywhere. It was sacred and obscene, liberating and crushing public and private law and rebellion. It was empire in its most human form, and you've now walked deeper than most ever dare. The moon hangs low and full, casting a ghostly sheen across the rooftops of Rome. You move silently now, almost floating above the stones, passing beneath laundry lines and broken statues, as if the city has thinned into a veil between worlds. Behind you lie bathhouses, temples, bedsheets stained by power and submission. Ahead, a place the Romans rarely spoke of aloud, but everyone knew: the execution grounds. Because Rome's sexual excess didn't just lead to scandal. Sometimes it led to death. You arrive at the Gemonian Stairs, a grim slope that spills into the Tiber. It's quiet now, but centuries of screams have soaked into the stone. You remember the stories of lovers caught in the wrong bed, of freedmen turned traitors through affairs of women sentenced for daring to own their own desire. One such woman was Clodia Pulchra. Wealthy, literate, scandalously bold. Her love affairs with poets and politicians, especially the infamous Catullus, earned her not just gossip, but charges. They called her Lesbia both for her rumored taste in women and her association with Sappho. Her crime sleeping with men, and possibly women, without shame. She was never convicted, but her reputation was executed publicly in poetry and court. Rome punished women differently. If you were elite, they tore you down with slander. If you were poor, they used your body until it broke. If you were enslaved, no one even recorded your name. But every now and then, one voice broke through. You remember juvenile Rome's bitterest satirist. He hated female pleasure, loathed powerful women who spoke their minds. He wrote screeds against wives who cheated women who read philosophy, women who enjoyed sex too much, or worse, admitted it. And yet in his fury, he revealed something else. Rome feared female pleasure. Not because it was immoral, but because it was uncontrolled. You pass a wall now scribbled with graffiti. Not propaganda, not philosophy, just notes. I screwed Lupa here. Marcus paid 2 asses for an hour. Virgilia is the best in the Sobura. These weren't carved by vandals. They were confessions, brags, complaints, even ratings. The ancient Yelp of Rome's sexual economy. And one phrase is repeated over and over like a heartbeat carved in stone. Felicitas habitat hic happiness lives here. Above brothels, outside homes, even on tombs. It's ironic, because in Rome happiness was always transactional. It had a price, sometimes a coin, sometimes your reputation. You move next into a small courtyard garden tucked behind a tailor's shop. It's past midnight. You hear laughter, gentle, drunken. A group of young men are sprawled on the grass, half-dressed, passing a wineskin. One plays a reed flute. Another recites poetry, Ovid maybe, or something more recent. And then in a moment that's both intimate and utterly Roman, 2 of them begin to kiss. The others cheer, then join in unashamed, playful, free. These aren't courtesans or clients or politicians. They're just people, young, lustful, alive. And you feel it again, the strange paradox of this place. Rome could be so cruel, so calculating. And yet, there were cracks in the marble. Cracks wide enough for something almost like love. But love had no protection under Roman law. There was no marriage for same-sex partners, no inheritance, no ceremony. A man might keep a lover for decades and still be forced to marry a woman for politics. A woman might share a life with another woman and yet on paper remain unmarried until death. Their stories had to live in margins, on grave inscriptions, in passing verses, in metaphors that barely concealed the truth. You find yourself inside a dim apartment above a wine shop. 2 women lie in bed, their legs tangled like ivy. One snores softly, the other brushes her fingers over the other's bare shoulder. They'll wake soon, dress, return to roles no one questions. But tonight, they were whole. Outside, the wind rustles the canopy of vines growing over the archways. You hear the soft creak of a balcony. A man leans out, smoking a bitter herb. His eyes catch yours. He knows. Not who you are, but what you are. A witness. And you are. You've seen things most Romans would never admit aloud. Things they practiced behind draped curtains, beneath temple robes in cellar rooms and open forums alike. You've seen emperors dress as brides, matrons disguised as boys, gladiators reduced to pets, slaves elevated to gods for a night. And yet it never stops. Rome rolls forward. New lovers, new scandals, new euphemisms for old acts. The city feeds on desire like a lion feeds on flesh, loud, messy, beautiful. You head now to the Mausoleum of Augustus, a towering tomb built by a man who tried to restore Roman virtue through strict moral laws. He banned adultery, exiled his own daughter, created a public office to reward women who bore multiple children. But even Augustus, stoic, strategic Augustus, had his own affairs. His wife Livia was rumored to have orchestrated every marriage and mistress he ever touched. The irony is not lost on you. You step up to the marble base, read the carved inscription, Res Gestae Divi Augusti, the deeds of the divine Augustus. But there's nothing here about the lovers, the laws broken, the lives ruined to maintain the illusion of order. Because that was Rome's true genius, dressing vice in virtue, covering cruelty with silk, draping lust in laurels. And now the wind picks up. The lamps in the street gutters flicker and die one by one. You're left in the soft hush of early morning, Rome's most honest hour. The hour between indulgence and regret, between bodies and masks, between forgetting and remembering. And you, drifting onward, carry all of it with you. The blush of the bathhouses, the whispers behind veils, the punishment for pleasure, the hunger that built an empire. The sky is steel gray now, the last stars swallowed by morning haze. Rome stretches before you like a body exhaling after a long, feverish night. You're no longer surprised by what you see. You've walked its alleys and chambers, watched its lovers, its victims, its secret dancers and bruised gods. But now you're pulled west toward the Campus Martius, where the wealthy retreat to their summer homes, and where new layers of desire unspool like smoke from censers. You enter the villa of a Roman equestrian rich, respected, but not quite elite. He prides himself on taste rather than birth. His walls are painted with scenes of Greek myths, Narcissus gazing at himself in the pool, Hermaphroditus being fused with Salmacis, a god becoming both man and woman in a single writhing form. These aren't just art. They are confession curated for those who know how to read the language of lust hidden in pigment and brushstroke. Inside the equestrian hosts, symposiums, private salons of wine talk and flirtation. Tonight's guest list includes a Stoic philosopher, a young Syrian courtesan, a senator's daughter disguised in her brother's cloak, and 2 actors recently freed from bondage. Everyone pretends it's about poetry. It never is. As wine is poured and jokes drift lazily through the room, the conversation turns inevitably to pleasure. The philosopher declares that true desire must be conquered, not indulged. The courtesan laughs and places a single finger on his chest. Then why she asks, is your heart racing? No one answers. Instead, the host claps twice and a door opens. 2 dancers step inside, one male, one female, identical in every detail. They move in perfect mirror, shedding veils, crossing limbs, becoming indistinguishable. It's not just erotic, it's disorienting, deliberate. A game with gender, with perception, with power. You understand watching that Rome's elite weren't merely indulgent. They were theatrical. Desire was a performance, and everyone had their role. You slip away from the gathering and follow a side road toward the Aventine Hill. There, tucked between warehouses and grain stores, you find a curious sight, a shrine to Bonadea, the good goddess. Her cult is secret, sacred, and strictly female. No men allowed, not even animals with masculine names. Her rites are mysterious, known only to initiates. But one scandal made it infamous. You recall the tale Clodius Pulcher, a brazen politician once disguised himself as a woman and snuck into the Bona Dea festival to seduce Caesar's wife. He was discovered, and tried for sacrilege. He claimed he was innocent. The scandal rocked Rome, not because he attempted seduction, but because he violated sacred female space. Even the debauched had boundaries. But what really happened inside those rites, some say women drank wine from urns labeled milk, that they whipped themselves into frenzy, that snakes were involved, and music that made their bodies sway as if pulled by strings. Were these rumors or just the truths? Rome couldn't accept that women had their own desire, their own gods, their own secrets untouched by male gaze. You move next to a more mundane scene. A weaver's workshop. Inside, 5 women spin wool, talking, laughing, sometimes pausing to peer through the thin curtains when a soldier walks by. One of them, her name is Tullia, leans close to another, brushes a strand of hair from her cheek. They don't kiss. They don't speak. But the touch lingers weighted with all the things Rome refuses to name. It's easy to forget in all the spectacle and scandal that most Romans lived small lives, that their pleasures were brief, stolen, domestic, that seduction might be nothing more than a glance, a touch of the hand, while exchanging bread, a word of poetry muttered between chores. You drift into a bakery, the scent of flour and ash thick in the air. A young man kneads dough, biceps flexing with each movement. A patron watches him too long. The boy notices, smiles. Nothing happens. But maybe something will later. Rome ran on flour wine and suggestion. Outside again, the streets begin to buzz, not with sex, but with trade. Men shout prices. Children chase dogs. Slaves carry jugs of water, and among them all, desire hums like a buried current. A man adjusts his tunic to catch the eye of a passing soldier. A woman traces her lip with the edge of a pomegranate rind. No one says anything, but the signals are everywhere. The city speaks 1,000 languages, and one of them is always want. You make your way to the Tiber's edge where a small ferry boat waits to cross. On board, a merchant and his bodyguards stand closer than necessary. Their shoulders brush. One looks down, the other smirks. You wonder how long this game has gone on. Months, years. Is this their first touch or their last? The boat drifts across the dark water, slow as honey. Rome stretches out on both sides, its temples and brothels, its laughter and laments. And you see now the city was never divided into clean lines. Every noble had their vice, every beggar a fantasy, every rule a loophole. Even purity was often just disguise. As the boat docks, you're met by a statue of Venus rising from the foam. She is naked, arms open, eyes blank. She's been kissed by countless fingers, offerings of flowers and coins piled at her feet. But Venus doesn't judge. She accepts it all, lust and longing, fidelity and betrayal, power and powerlessness. You wonder how many prayers she's heard whispered in the dead of night. How many gasps she's seen behind curtains. How many dreams she holds in her stone silence. The sky grows warmer. The wind stirs your hair. Rome breathes, stretching again into day. And you carry its pulse inside you now. The warmth of the sun spills across the rooftops like golden wine, and the streets begin to swell with life. You're no longer wandering through darkness and shadow. Now you're walking through the bright exposed Rome where senators parade in their togas, merchants hawk silk and saffron, and matrons sit on balconies fanning themselves like peacocks on display. But don't be fooled by the light. This is still the same city that hungers beneath the surface. You begin in the heart of the Forum Romanum, where business is conducted in loud voices and serious gestures. But between every contract and coin there are whispers. A trader from Antioch offers more than spices. A scribe slips letters to a married man on behalf of a bored wife. The marble columns echo not just the law, but its violations. Because here in the very seat of Roman authority, desire is negotiated as often as taxes. Just behind the curia in the shadow of the Senate stands a small statue of Priapus, his enormous phallus gleaming with the sheen of countless touches. Some laugh and pat it as they pass. Others look away. But you can see the truth. Priapus is not just a garden god. He is Rome's joke, its fetish, its warning. His rigid form is meant to protect property, but also to threaten violation. He represents potency, yes, but also punishment. And that duality is everywhere in this city. Especially now, as you head toward a domus, where a marriage is being arranged not for love, not even for alliance, but for silence. Inside, a wealthy widow stands beside her daughter. The girl is maybe 12. Her new fiancé is 35, balding prosperous. No one speaks of attraction. That's not what this is about. The family has debts. The man has political ambitions. The girl has no say. But her mother knows. She remembers her own wedding. She remembers her first night, how cold the marble floor was beneath her feet, as she undressed, how his hands smelled of wine and oil. She watches her daughter now and says nothing, because this is Rome, and silence is what protects you. You walk through the atrium and into a back room where the bride's dowry is being counted. Gold coins, linen, a slave girl. Yes, even a human life is part of the negotiation. Her name is Livia. She stands still, eyes downcast, already knowing what will happen to her once she crosses into her new master's house. She is 17, quiet, and utterly forgotten. But she has a secret, one the house doesn't know. At night, when her duties are done and the villa sleeps, Livia meets another slave in the kitchen, a boy named Felix. They've never kissed. They've never even touched. But they sit close in the dark, whispering stories about the sea, about freedom, about other lives. And in those moments, they are not owned. They are not tools. They are lovers in a city that has no place for them. You leave the villa with that fragile tenderness still clinging to you and walk now to the Circus Maximus where chariots race and crowds roar. The energy is electric, and yet beneath the competition something else pulses: admiration, longing, worship. The charioteers, young, tanned, fearless, are idols. Some are slaves, others are freemen. All are adored. You hear women shouting their names. You see men toss wreaths into the arena. Some fans tattoo the faces of their favorite racers on their arms, others write them poetry. The boundaries between sport and seduction blur easily here. And in the baths afterward, those lines dissolve entirely. You wander the changing rooms where racers bathe bruised limbs, servants scrub backs, and hands linger too long under the surface. Here, intimacy is silent, but not secret. Everyone knows what happens after the final lap. Some charioteers are bought and kept as lovers. Others use their fame to bed their way up the social ladder. Rome makes no apologies. Sex and spectacle have always held hands. Now you descend into a shaded alley near the Theater of Pompeii, where another form of performance unfolds. In a dim courtyard, a troupe of dancers rehearse a pantomime, a sensual retelling of the myth of Ganymede, the beautiful boy taken by Jupiter to serve as his cupbearer, and it's implied his lover. The lead dancer is androgynous, graceful, magnetic. He wears a short tunic and golden sandals. As he moves, you see the audience stir, men and women alike. Some are aroused, others scandalized. Most are both. The performance isn't just about art, it's about seduction, and the dancer knows it. He bows, sweat glistening down his neck. A nobleman in the back claps slowly, eyes fixed on him like prey. Later you'll see them leave together, the dancer following 2 steps behind. Not as a slave, not as an equal, but as something in between, desired, paid for, disposable. You return to the streets as the heat of the day begins to wane. The shadows lengthen. The air thickens with anticipation. You pass a bakery, a wine shop, a street vendor selling garlands of Myrtle Venus's flower. Everywhere small rituals of seduction unfold. A touch on the wrist. A compliment said just loud enough to be overheard. A spilled drink that needs cleaning up. Rome is not just a place. It's an appetite. You stop at a fountain where a young boy sits reading a scroll of poetry. You recognize the lines, "I hate and I love." Why do I do this, you ask? I don't know. But I feel it and I'm torn apart. It's Catullus speaking from centuries past. And yet, it's now. It's this city. It's every person who's ever tried to hold pleasure and pain in the same breath. The boy looks up, smiles. He doesn't know he's just summarized Rome's entire erotic soul. And as night gathers once more and torches are lit, and silk shifts against skin behind closed doors, you understand the empire has no center when it comes to sex. It moves like the Tiber, sometimes calm, sometimes raging, always changing course, always dragging debris and beauty with it. You've seen the temples and the tenements. You've touched the silks and the scars. And still, Rome whispers more. The torchlight glows now like molten amber, and Rome has entered its most theatrical hour, when the city becomes a stage, and every act of touch, glance, and laughter is cast in soft golden haze. You're walking through the Trastevere district now, across the river from the heart of the empire. It's humbler here, more chaotic, but no less charged. The wine flows stronger, the rules are looser, and the bodies closer. You pass a tavern where music tumbles from open windows. Inside, workers crowd around a lute player, clapping in time, flushed with drink and joy. But in the back, something else plays out. A dice game is unfolding. A woman leans over a soldier's shoulder, her breath at his ear, her fingers tracing invisible letters on his neck. She wins the bet. Not with the dice, but with the promise in her eyes. Here in the margins, desire is direct. There's no need for veils or poetry. Love is a transaction or a relief or a dare. It's a shared loaf of bread after a long shift, a stolen kiss in the alley behind the butcher's shop, a grope that turns into a secret arrangement. It's not less important because it's crude. In some ways, it's more honest than what you saw behind the walls of the elite. You slip through a garden now, one maintained by an elderly couple. They prune roses during the day, but at night they rent the back room of their home for lovers who can't meet in their own beds. There's a cot, a curtain, and a dish of rose water for washing. That's all. But for some, those bound by duty, by law, by status, it's enough. You hear quiet voices now. 2 men. One older, one younger. They speak in soft Latin, the kind used by poets, not soldiers. You don't see them. You only hear them, and that's all it takes. Further down the path, you come to a small temple, not of Venus or Priapus, but of Mutunus Tutunus, Rome's most ancient phallic god. His shrine is rarely spoken of in polite society, though everyone knows of it. The god himself was often portrayed with a comically oversized member, and it's said that young brides were made to sit on his statue before their wedding night. Not to pray, to prepare, to laugh, to surrender. The ritual was meant to defang fear, to bridge the gap between maidenhood and wifehood, with humor, mythology, and just enough public embarrassment to make obedience seem less like a loss. But you see it now for what it really was, Rome's way of controlling the terror women carried into their first nights of sex. Make it a joke, make it divine. But never ask if it should happen at all. You drift from the shrine into a procession, a group of youths dancing with torches, singing songs of Liber Pater, the god of wine freedom and ecstatic rites. Their clothes are tattered by design, their cheeks painted, their eyes wide with frenzy. You follow as they twirl through the streets, laughing, lifting their arms to the sky. One girl throws her tunic to the wind and dances naked, unashamed. The crowd cheers. A man joins her. Another follows. Within minutes, they are a rolling ball of limbs and laughter. This is not an orgy, not quite, but it's something ancient, a yearning to dissolve, to break the skin of self and melt into others. Rome knew this urge well. It tried to contain it with rules, festivals, roles. But every so often it spilled over. You leave them behind and enter a villa through a servant's entrance. Inside, a wealthy woman lies in her cubiculum, eyes closed, arms above her head. She breathes slowly, rhythmically, not in sleep, in preparation. A male slave enters, stripped to the waist, his face expressionless. He approaches without a word. They've done this before. He is not a lover. She is not cruel. But this is not affection. It's release. It's power inversion. She holds the reins of the day. But here in darkness, she wants to feel powerless just for a moment. And he with no rights, no voice, no name becomes the one who is obeyed. It is cruel and tender and wrong and real and Roman. Outside, you hear the sounds of another kind of theater. A dominus of a large household has staged a private performance of a tell-and-farce, Rome's oldest form of ribald comedy. The actors wear grotesque masks, huge noses, exaggerated lips, absurdly bulging phalluses strapped around their waists. The audience laughs as the characters stumble through bawdy scenes, a cheating wife, a lecherous priest, a trickster slave outwitting his master. It's vulgar, it's predictable, but it works. Why? Because Rome needed to laugh at its own sins. It needed to watch the farce, knowing it mirrored truth. These plays were both catharsis and confession, a way for citizens to see themselves exaggerated, exposed, but ultimately safe in the fiction of the stage. You linger near the exit as the audience disperses. A boy walks past, humming the tune from the play, trailing behind a man who is not his father. They don't speak. They don't need to. You return once more to the bathhouse district, now quiet, its steam long gone cold. The rooms are dark, but you remember their sounds. You walk past empty chambers. One still smells faintly of lavender, another of sweat. You sit at the edge of a drained pool and close your eyes, and in the silence you hear everything again. The gasps of pleasure and power, the sobs of those forgotten, the laughter of those in masks, the whispers behind locked doors. This is Rome. It does not judge. It does not forgive. It remembers. Always. And so do you. The night air curls around you like a lover's breath, warm, persistent, impossible to ignore. Rome has slipped back into darkness, but the city doesn't sleep. It simmers, beneath the palatial roofs, behind shuttered windows, and under flickering torchlight. Bodies stir and whispers bloom like vines over crumbling stone. You wander now through the Palatine Hill, but not the glittering banquet halls you saw before. No. This time you find yourself in the servant quarters. Narrow hallways, cold floors. Lives lived quietly in the margins of imperial opulence. Here, sex isn't pleasure. It's expectation. In a cramped room, a young man sits silently on a low stool. His tunic is undone. He's waiting. Not for someone he loves, but for someone who owns him. A noblewoman enters without knocking. Her rings glint in the lamplight. She doesn't speak. She just moves toward him. He doesn't flinch. He's done this before. You look away, but only briefly, because this too is Rome, an empire that trained men to conquer the world and told them it was perfectly acceptable to be conquered behind closed doors as long as they never admitted it. An empire where women with no legal power could still exert their will through those beneath them. Where silence was a transaction, and yet not all was coercion. You pass a doorway where two slaves lie, tangled in a stolen moment of softness. Their hands explore with reverence, their bodies moving not with haste, but with hunger and care. They are not allowed to marry. Their children, if born, will be born into slavery. They have nothing. But for now, in this breathless hush, they are human. You continue through the underbelly of the palace, and soon you find yourself in the scriptorium, a dim room where records are copied, decrees written, and history bent. You watch as a young scribe transcribes letters from an aristocrat's mistress. The words drip with longing. Your absence burns me, but your touch still sings across my thighs. She signs with a pseudonym, Flora, perhaps. Never her real name. If caught, the letters could ruin reputations, shatter marriages, end lives. But even as she writes, she knows sometimes words are safer than kisses. Nearby, another scroll lies open. It's a list not of taxes or births, but of those fined under the Lex Julia Augustus's great morality law. You recognize the names. Senators, generals, even poets, charged with adultery, with seduction, with violating the purity of Roman lineage. But look closer. The names are mostly of women. The men walk free. Their careers continue. The women exiled, forgotten, buried. You leave the scribes behind, heart-heavy, and drift toward the heart of the city, the Pantheon. Its massive dome seems to drink the sky. Inside, it's cool, vast, echoing. You've seen this temple before, but now at night it feels different, intimate, less divine, more mortal. A priest walks silently among the columns. He is not old. His robe is white. His eyes are tired. You sense something beneath his devotion, a loneliness, a weight. Rome allowed its priests to be close to the divine, but never to another body. Celibacy wasn't law, but it was expected. And those expectations shaped lives like chisels to marble. He pauses beside the statue of Venus Genetrix, mother of Aeneas, ancestor of Rome. Her breasts are bared. Her hand rests on a draped hip. She is both maternal and erotic, sacred and sensual. The priest kneels before her and whispers something you can't quite hear. It isn't a prayer. It's a confession. You step back into the street. You're surrounded by monuments now. Marble columns, bronze statues, obelisks stolen from Egypt. All testaments to conquest, to dominance, to permanence. But what about the desires of those who built them, whose bodies carried stones, cooked the meals, bore the children, warmed the beds? Rome built temples to gods of lust, but rarely named the people who gave their lives to satisfy the hunger of the powerful. Still, some names survived. In graffiti, in tombs, in scandal. You pass a funerary stele carved with the image of two women side by side. One holds a spindle of wool, the other a scroll. Their inscription is brief: together in life, together in rest. There's no husband named, no sons, just them, quiet, proud, eternal. It's not an open declaration, but it doesn't have to be. The stone says everything. You move now toward a marketplace closed for the night, but not silent. A couple sits at the edge of a stall, legs intertwined. A prostitute passes by with a basket of offerings for her household goons. A former gladiator helps a blind man cross the road. Each moment is small, but pulsing with the same thread you've followed all this time: intimacy. Because Rome wasn't just orgies and scandal. It was also hands held under tables, letters hidden in sandals, perfumed locks of hair wrapped in linen. It was lust, yes, but also love, affection, hope. You arrive at a bridge crossing the Tiber, the Pons Fabricius. Couples stroll across, voices low, steps slow. You watch one man slip a ring onto another's finger. It's not legal. There's no ceremony, no witnesses, but they treat it like a vow. They kiss, gently, just once. And in that moment, all the scrolls, all the statues, all the laws, none of it matters. Because here, under starlight and over water, Rome is not just empire. It is human. And that more than anything is what survives. The bridge fades behind you as you walk deeper into the quietest hours of the Roman night. The sky is a velvet dome pierced by stars that flicker like the dying embers of lamps. Even the city, so loud, so pulsing, seems to hold its breath. You are walking now, not through streets, but through echoes. And with every step, Rome's secrets unfold like petals soaked in perfume and time. You pass beneath an archway near the Capitoline Hill, where a statue of Mars stands tall, sword at his hip, eyes fixed forward. He is the god of war, yes, but also strangely of virility. He fathered Romulus and Remus after all. He was protector, destroyer, lover. And Rome, his city, carried all of him in its bones. You turn down a narrow corridor. A torch burns low outside a townhouse. Inside, an old man lies in bed beside a younger male servant. They don't touch, but they don't speak either. You can feel something long settled between them. Years of glances of duties, shared of quiet arrangements that never became declarations. Rome doesn't need declarations. It only needs endurance. In the corner, a small household altar glows with flickering flame. On it, a tiny statuette of Cupid reclines with his bow. The god of desire, but also mischief. The Romans both feared and adored him, because Cupid did not ask permission. He pierced hearts with no warning, and that was dangerous in a world built on order. As you leave the townhouse, you hear a rustle and turn. A slave woman no more than 20 is being led by a nobleman through a side street. She's dressed in finery, her hair carefully curled. Tonight she'll dine at his table. Tomorrow she may be discarded or given away as a wedding gift. But for this night, she walks with the illusion of status. And maybe that's the cruelest trick Rome ever played. It made people believe that proximity to pleasure was the same as power. You keep walking, past a villa garden where rose petals cover the marble floor, the aftermath of a private banquet that turned, as they often did, into performance. The slaves have begun cleaning. One sweeps up goblets and broken earrings. Another scrubs the floor where someone spilled wine or blood. It's hard to tell. A pair of musicians sit near the gate resting. One leans his head on the other's shoulder. They say nothing. They don't need to. Their fingers are intertwined. Music was their job. This quiet touch is their sanctuary. And you, invisible, are everywhere now. Moving through places that have no names on maps. Rooms that never made it into scrolls. Moments too soft or shameful to be written down. But they happened. All of it. The public, the hidden, the shameful, the sacred. You find yourself now at the edge of the Forum Boarium, Rome's ancient cattle market. But here in the shadows is a different kind of exchange. A man hands over coins, and a boy disappears with him behind the columns of the Temple of Portunus. It's fast, routine. No one intervenes. Because in Rome, so long as you held the higher status, you were permitted nearly anything. Even this. And yet not everything escapes consequence. You remember Emperor Elagabalus. He made no effort to disguise his desires. He wore women's clothing, insisted on being called a goddess, took men as lovers, and even referred to himself as a bride. He installed his lover as chancellor. He married a charioteer. He held contests among palace guests to see who had the largest endowment. He lived his truth so openly that it became impossible to ignore. Rome tolerated excess, but not visibility. At only 18, Elagabalus was assassinated. His body dragged through the streets, stripped, mutilated, tossed into the Tiber like a shameful secret. Not because he sinned more than others, but because he dared to sin out loud. That is the line Rome never let you cross, not the act, but the admission. You pause at the edge of the river now. The water reflects the flicker of torchlight, and you see your own face shimmering, distorted, like Rome itself. Beautiful, but impossible to hold without bleeding a little. From here, you look back at the city, the temples, the brothels, the fountains, the forums, the frescoes. You remember the wife who kissed her maid in secret, the gladiator who wept after his last match and found comfort in his enemy's arms, the priest who lit candles not for Jupiter, but for the man he once loved and lost, the senator who kept a letter from a prostitute folded in his cloak until the day he died. And then you realize these weren't exceptions. They were the truth. Rome was built on conquest, yes, but it was also built on longing. And those longings are still here, etched into the walls, the stone, the silence. You walk on, because the story isn't finished yet. And neither are the secrets. The stars are fading now, their silver brilliance slowly dissolving into the gray blush of dawn. Rome exhales again, this time softer, tired from its own indulgence. You're nearing the end of your journey, and yet it doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like a confession still whispering beneath every tile and torch. You cross the Via Appia, the queen of roads where soldiers once marched and lovers once fled. The stones are slick with dew and your footsteps echo between mausoleums. These tombs are grand, carved with Latin verses and family crests. But as you move deeper into this ancient necropolis, the tombs grow humbler, stones etched by hand, names fading. One stands out. A husband and wife arms entwined their epitaph, who lived together 30 years and never a day apart. But beneath it, someone else has scratched a second line later, and cruder, she slept with the baker. You almost laugh. Even here in death, Rome can't help but gossip. You walk toward the edge of a vineyard where two men work the vines. One stops to sip water, the other wipes sweat from his brow. You watch them lean into each other, press foreheads, smile. Nothing dramatic. No hiding either. In this simple act, you see something Rome rarely allowed: contentment. But most were not so lucky. You remember the deliciae, the pleasure slaves, young boys or girls trained from childhood to entertain the wealthy. They were educated, perfumed, dressed in silks too fine for their station. They could recite poetry, play the lyre, mix the emperor's wine to the perfect ratio. They were desired, envied, and never free. Their names rarely made it into history. Their bruises never made it into art. And yet some left traces. A broken ring with initials carved inside. A wax tablet hidden in a cellar wall, scrawled with words in childish Latin. I want to run, you visit the lupanar of Pompeii next, not in the flesh, but in memory. Preserved by ash, its walls still boast crude frescoes of men and women in every position imaginable. The rooms are small stone beds, barely wide enough for two. The names of workers are scratched above each door, follicula. Daphne, Fortunata. Archaeologists once tried to describe these places as shameful. But you know better. These rooms were places of survival, of labor, of performance. Some patrons came for release, others for power. But the women who worked here, they came because they had no choice. And yet even here, some laughed, some sang, some chose who they smiled for. And that, however small, was its own rebellion. You continue now to the house of the Vetii, a wealthy merchant's home decorated with explicit erotic art. On one wall, Priapus weighs his enormous phallus against a bag of coins. The message is clear: sex and wealth forever entangled. Upstairs, a mural shows a woman atop a man, hair loose, gaze direct. She is not submissive. She is not embarrassed. She is in control. And the fact that she remains, centuries later, defiant and unashamed, feels like a victory. You find yourself now on the Capitoline Hill as the sun breaks over Rome. Gold spills across the rooftops, and the entire city seems to glow from within. You stand above it all and feel the weight of what you've seen. The orgies behind velvet curtains, the quiet kisses stolen in alleyways, the women sacrificed for family name, the men punished for softness, the gods painted with open thighs and curling fingers. Rome worshipped sex, but only when it served power. It celebrated desire, but only when contained. And yet across centuries, across ruins and whispers, it failed to kill the truth that love, real love, lived here too. In between the moans and poems, in the letters folded under mattresses, in the eyes that found each other across crowded forums, and in every hand that dared to reach out when it wasn't supposed to. So now, dear listener, as your own body begins to relax beneath the weight of this long, decadent journey, know this Rome was not just marble and blood. It was skin, it was breath, it was shame and longing, and the unkillable urge to touch, to be touched, to matter. And you've seen it all now, from the pleasure palaces to the temple shadows, from silk sheets to blood-stained stones, from laughter to silence, and in all of it something terribly beautifully human. And now, it's time to rest. You've traveled far tonight, through torchlit bedrooms and marble corridors, through the minds of emperors and the hands of forgotten slaves. You've seen what few would dare admit, even in the privacy of thought. And now, as your eyes begin to grow heavy and your breath softens, let Rome begin to fade around you. Let the echo of footsteps in brothels quiet to a hum. Let the laughter from banquets melt into distant music. Let the torchlight dim until it's just a memory behind your eyelids. This empire, so loud, so relentless, cannot follow you here, not into sleep. Let its contradictions dissolve, its cruelty soften, its hunger ebb away. You are safe now. Let the silk of the sheets wrap you like a tunic drawn gently over bare skin. Let the night air carry the scent of rosemary and oil. Let your limbs rest in the way Rome never did in peace. The stories will still be here when you wake. But for now, let silence take the stage. Let your breath fall into rhythm and drift downward into calm.